4 years ago, Americans set a very different course by selecting Donald Trump as president. Well, at least the Electoral College did. The majority of voters did not. Trump's foreign policy was a striking departure in many ways from his predecessors. And while many outside observers expected this 2020 election to reverse that, the deeply divided American electorate clearly has not made that clear-cut choice. With us now on what the U.S. election day and maybe week means to the rest of the world, we welcome, in Oxford, UK, Timothy Garton Ash, Professor of European Studies at the University of Oxford and a Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. In Waterloo, Ontario, Besma Momani, Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and a Senior Fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation. And in the provincial capital, in the annex, there's Janice Stein, Belzberg Professor of Conflict Management in the Department of Political Science and the founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at U of T, and Seva Gunitsky, author of Aftershocks, Great Powers and Domestic Reforms in the 20th Century. He's also a professor of political science at the U of T who joins us from the downtown St. George campus tonight. Zdravstvuyte, Seva. Nice to have everybody else on the program. Well, if you stayed up till 2:15 this morning, you would have seen some of this. Sheldon, roll it, please.
I'm here to tell you tonight, we believe we're on track to win this election. We knew because of the unprecedented early vote and the mail-in vote that it was going to take a while. We're going to have to be patient until the hard work of tallying the votes is finished. And it ain't over till every vote is counted. As I've said all along, it's not my place or Donald Trump's place to declare who's won this election. That's the decision of the American people.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list.
Well, 4 years ago, a lot of people were shocked because they clearly did not understand the America they thought they knew. That was one of the big takeaways. Timothy, get us started here. What do we now know about America after seeing the returns come in last night that we perhaps didn't know before the start of the day?
Well, this is clearly the most important American election in my lifetime. And if Donald Trump does become president again by hook or by crook, and I think that phrase is quite appropriate, it will, in my view, spell the end of the transatlantic West as we've known it since 1945. What we know already, even if Biden becomes president, is number one, that more Americans voted for Trump this time than last time, and that in itself, despite or perhaps because of what they know about his character, and that in itself is a shocking fact. Number two, that he has, as we saw in the clip, questioned the fundamental legitimacy of the electoral process and the result. And that means that even if it's President Biden, there'll be millions of Americans who question the basic legitimacy of his presidency. And number three, that unless the Democrats get the Senate, President Biden will have a divided government and therefore be in a very weak position to do the kind of fundamental reforms, I would say a kind of perestroika, that is actually needed in the United States.
Janice, what do you know about America now that you didn't know before election night?
What I know is that, and I agree completely with Timothy, that American democracy is at peril. You know, Steve, democracy means many things, but one thing it does mean is losing with grace. And we lose with grace because we have fundamental confidence that the rules are fair. And 3 years, 4 years later, you compete again and you stand a chance of winning. What Donald Trump has done, and it's really astonishing over these last 2 months, is go root and branch in an attack on the fundamental rules of the game and tell the American public that the rules are rigged. This transcends anything we've seen in the history of the American Republic, short of the Civil War, frankly. And whatever comes out of this election, and it does matter what does, but whatever comes out of this election, American democracy is wounded. And because democracy is wounded in the United States, its world leadership is wounded, its alliance relationships are wounded. This is, I think, one of these hinge moments in history.
Besma Momani, what do you know now you didn't know 36 hours ago?
Well, I mean, I think how resilient Trumpism and the entire populist nationalist narrative is in the United States. It really has, I think, echoed and reverberated throughout the United States. Certainly, I think some of that is economic. We can see in the Rust Belt states, if the results continue as projected, that Trump may in fact keep these states. The reality is there is still a lot of anti-free trade sentiment that Trump continues to hit home at. He's seen as tough on China, which I think resonates in these states. Certainly, the sort of xenophobic anti-immigrant argument that he has portrayed and reiterated really does resonate throughout much of Trump America. And certainly, I think the last thing that really stands out is perhaps the coronavirus angle of this. The critique that Biden would return people to some sort of lockdown, which does not, play well here. I'm in the populist national space. There's a great deal of skepticism against all medical advice, and that these public health officials are somehow trying to prevent the flourishing of, the American economic system, which I know sounds really odd to us, but it really, I think, resonates. And that's what this election tells me, is that there's a great deal of critique and distrust of public health officials, medical experts, and Trump really is a supporter of all of that populist nationalist sentiment that is so deep in the country.
I guess we got lots of evidence of that the other day when we heard a big crowd start to yell, "Fire Fauci, fire Fauci." Anyway, Seva Gunitsky, what would you add to what we've heard so far?
Well, I'm not sure we've learned a lot of new things. I think a lot of Democrats and a lot of liberals were hoping to see a decisive rejection of Trump and the Republican Party, and that hasn't happened. And that's the disappointment. That catharsis never came. But it's an expected disappointment. Nevertheless, it's a disappointment because of what it says about the country, that Trump is not a fluke, that polarization is extreme, and it's not going anywhere. So even if Trump leaves peacefully, he has planted the seeds of a nationalist authoritarian movement that will continue to shape GOP politics.
Can I follow up with you on that? You really think that this nudges us, or nudges them, I guess, and maybe by extension much of the rest of the world, closer to authoritarianism?
Well, in what it has shown, in the lack of clarity around the voting process, around Trump's statements, it has not been a great day for American democracy, regardless of the outcome, even if Trump leaves peacefully. And remember, keep in mind, what this election reinforced to the rest of the world, again, is the idiosyncrasies of the U.S. voting system. It's true that Trump got more votes this time than he did 4 years ago, but Biden is on track to receive over 70 million votes, and once again to receive 2-3 million more votes than Trump, as Clinton did 4 years ago. And Biden, in fact, got more votes than Obama did in either election. Yet here we are talking about the uncertainty of the next few days or the next few months. I think that speaks to some deep problems in the institutional makeup of the United States that will not be going away regardless of the outcome of this election.
Let me pursue that with Timothy. Yes, it's true, Donald Trump found millions more voters this time than he did last time, but so did the Democratic presidential candidate. And I wonder if you take any heart from the fact that Biden still, at the end of the day, will have more votes than Trump.
So did Hillary Clinton. Look, I'm frankly very disappointed that with everything the American people knew about that president, both the staggering incompetence and callousness of his handling of the COVID crisis and his character, so many people still voted for him. I want to pick up on what Seva said, because I think it really does mean that people no longer look to the United States as a model for democracy. Ironically, this very day, today as we speak, the United States has been lecturing a small African country called the Côte d'Ivoire on conducting a fair election and the rule of law. Well, the whole world now is going to turn around and basically say to the United States, physician, heal thyself.
Well, Janice, your last answer, Janice, definitely my eyebrows raised when you said this has truly wounded democracy. And I got to follow up on that. If at the end of the day, if after all the counting is done and all the legal challenges are over, if Trump loses and Biden comes in, I mean, is democracy restored in your eyes?
No. And I think that's a really fundamental point, Steve. Democracy everywhere is more fragile than we think it is. And what we have now in the United States is, to me, deeply worrying. There is the sense in both camps that if the other side wins, everything is lost. Certainly those who are so dismayed, as Timothy is today, to look at the support for Trumpism in the United States, feel that should Trump win, everything is lost. But what we fail to appreciate is that Trump voters feel that if Biden wins, everything is lost and their America is stolen. When you have those kinds of politics, it's fundamentally a war of all against all, and there's catastrophe waiting for the side that loses. Democracy is genuinely at peril. This goes beyond the results of this election and who wins this election, Steve. And I have to say, Timothy talked about the United States lecture in Cote d'Ivoire. There's been a wonderful thread going around of African political scientists suggesting a commission to come to the United States and help resolve the disputes, almost a satire on the way the United States has lectured around the world. And in some sense it has for 70 years. And often for good, not always, but often for good. Wounding this democracy to this degree is a wound to every democracy.
Well, Bestman, let me put it this way. Yesterday, on Election Day, another 1,000 Americans died from the coronavirus. We know there are plenty of Americans who are still hurting and haven't got their jobs back from before the pandemic hit. We know that there has been a racial reckoning in the United States over the past 8 months or so, the likes of which we haven't seen in many, many years. And in spite of all of that, Donald Trump not only kept his base, he actually grew it. He got more votes. I'm really curious as to what you think that says about America.
Well, obviously, it's very polarized, but I think, if we look at things through the Canadian lens, and remember here, if this vote was had in Canada, Biden would win overwhelmingly, I think, with 75% of the vote, if the polls are correct. And, we look at this through our Canadian lens and say, how can it be that Americans don't see through this, don't see through the fact that Trump is incompetent at managing this pandemic, et cetera. But I think what people don't realize is how strong the disinformation is out there, how very appealing the narrative is, that freedom is more important, one's personal liberty, to everything from not wearing a mask to being able to decide on one's own whether or not to comply with public health officials, all of that. And it really is, I think, very interesting to note that in many cases the Democrats spent far more money than the Republicans did. And yes, indeed, we saw that the Republicans were able to hold on to Congress, and who knows, we'll see with the Senate. And that just says that, despite all of what you think of America as being this, so many places, these bastions of progressive values and ideas, there is a strong undercurrent there of very strong conservative views, very pro-Republican, and Trump is a part of that. But, I think, frankly, if they had a more competent and amiable person, it would have been a landslide, right? The Republicans would have done an amazing job of getting so much, support. But the fact that Trump is who he is, I think, may have hurt them a little bit. But it just shows that the essence of the country is still very, very conservative. And there is a lot of, I think, reckoning to basically think about, how this is going to shape the future of American politics.
Well, let me build on that with Seva, and I'll get a little bit personal here, and I'll include myself in the mix here as well. My hunch is that many people in red state America can't stand the five of us. We are all very credentialed. We all have our university degrees. You folks are still working in the university environment. And they look at us and think, you all think you're so hot. And you all turn down your noses at us. And they
Speak for
feel,
yourself, Steve.
well, they feel very, I'm not telling any tales out of school here. They feel very humiliated. And to some extent, this is their revenge. Seva, let's do a round on this. Can you deny them their revenge, given how much they hate Democrats, how much they can't stand people like us, and now they're having their revenge? What do you think?
Well, I think some commentators make the mistake of thinking that people are choosing between two sets of policies, when really, for some people, for a lot of people, this is an existential choice, as has been mentioned already. It's not so much about the policy plans of either candidate, it's about what they represent and what worldview they represent. And so the fact that we've seen the number of votes for Trump increase, I think suggests that this goes beyond Trump, that there's a sense among some people out there that liberal centrists are indifferent to their plight, and that we sit in the ivory tower or whatever. And I think to some extent, liberals have to learn how to grapple with that better. We've seen a lot of conflict on the left between sort of the centrists and the more left-leaning supporters. And I think that's going to continue to play out, with a lot of people on the left saying, you should have run a better candidate than Biden. You should have ran with Bernie Sanders or whatever. Given the lack of a decisive Biden victory, that kind of inter-left conflict will only continue in the near future, I think.
Timothy, do you have any reason to believe the results of the election would have been any different had it been Bernie Sanders or Amy Klobuchar or Kamala Harris or anybody else at the top of the ticket?
I think there is some evidence, at least anecdotal, that actually some people voted not for Trump, not in spite of his character, but precisely because of his character. Look, we're talking all the time here about the United States, and there are some features of the United States that are exceptional, like the thing Janice pointed to, with these two entirely divorced media universes, the world of Fox and the world of MSNBC, two blocks of millions of people who have not just different views, but different facts. But many of the features we're talking about, including what you were just touching on, namely the resentment of liberal metropolitan people with higher education, is common to populist movements across the world. It was one of the best predictors of how people voted in the Brexit referendum, how people vote in Poland. A lot of people support Marine Le Pen in France against Emmanuel Macron. So this is part of a much larger phenomenon of a anti-liberal populist wave, which is very far from over. And I think the broader lesson of this experience is that rumors of the death of populism have been much exaggerated.
Yeah, Janice, let me pick up on that. Do people from the center left have to think of something different to say to the 68 million people who voted for Donald Trump? And just saying you're a bunch of deplorables is not going to cut it.
No, actually saying you're a bunch of deplorables is about the worst thing you can say, Steve. Let me just mention some evidence very early that is coming in from last night's election, which is really interesting, that Trump not only increased his vote, and he broadened the categories of voters who voted for him. And from what we know, and it's very early, he increased his Black vote. And he increased his support among Hispanic men. That suggests really that his appeal goes beyond the base of white men without college degrees who are a declining demographic. And he's successfully broadened his appeal beyond that base. It looks, by the way, that that where his vote has grown, mainly men still, which tells you something about the world that we're living in and the appeal of these, frankly, macho populist narratives, which is reaching out now across ethnic and racial groups, but not across gender groups. Let's see if that holds up, by the way, because it's so early. But your bigger point, I think, is so important, and Seva makes it as well. The narrative that condescending elites on the coasts who know it all, say it all, don't really listen and don't comprehend the concerns. I truly think this goes way beyond the pandemic. It is a much deeper distress of knowledgeable experts who are not great, frankly, at listening.
Esma, how do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think where the pandemic is relevant, and I go back to my previous point, because I think if you watch what these right-wing advocates are saying and the proponents, is really that this narrative coming from public health experts is going to basically kill what's left of the American economy. And when you have that economic anxiety already with the current situation we're all in, which does feel very restless, you know, that narrative really resonates. And I think there are many folks in the United States who are worried about their jobs, who are worried about the potential lockdown. And you had Biden's policies on oil and fracking. For some states, of course, that's a really important, vital economic resource. And, you know, that all plays into that fear mongering, and it worked. And I think that's something that we'll need to take from this too. You know, how coronavirus is being used by the populist nationalists is very much in keeping with the way they think about medical experts. And, you know, medical experts are a part of the elite, a part of the urban educated folks who, you know, have advice from a epidemiology perspective that may sound, you know, to us again in Canada seem reasonable, but to them is really about hitting at their livelihood. And so it's something that I think we're going to have to keep watching as this probably continues. As Timothy noted, populist nationalism, I think, is here to stay. And now coronavirus is only going to embolden those arguments.
Let me set up the next part of our discussion by playing a clip from a previous episode of The Agenda. And this is from an author and journalist here named Stephen Marsh, who had some very, Janice, I think you were on that show, some very scary things to say about what might come next. Sheldon, if you would, the clip.
The violence that we're seeing in Oregon, the violence that we're seeing on the streets, which is basically left-wing violence, is really going to be nothing compared to when the armed militias really start to make themselves felt, which they haven't yet. So, you know, I don't want to be alarmist, but on the other hand, I think that when you talk to the experts, what you're seeing here is a very classic spiral where the system of government no longer is legitimate to people. The legal system is no longer legitimate to people, and violence and chaos are the inevitable result.
And in fact, he went on to say he's predicting a second civil war in the United States. And Timothy, maybe you could start us off on this round. John Meacham, the very fine Pulitzer Prize-winning author and now broadcaster, he asked a pretty good question on American cable television this morning, which was, will Trump supporters respect the eventual legitimate outcome of this election if Biden wins, even if Donald Trump himself does not? Any insight on that?
So it's a question that's obviously exercising us all, because it's the first time I think anyone can remember when you have a president who is in effect inciting his supporters. You know, this famous remark in the TV debate of the Proud Boys, stand by, and then stand back, but stand by. So I think a lot depends on Trump himself and how he speaks to his supporters. My own hunch, for what it's worth, is that the danger of widespread violence is actually overstated. I mean, there are many countries around the world, and Seva knows a couple of them, where there is a tradition of political violence around contested elections. Historically, I don't think the United States is high on that list. So certainly my hope, but also my hunch, is that it may be contested, it may be regarded as illegitimate by a lot of Trump supporters and Fox News commentators, but my hunch is there won't be such widespread violence.
Seva, what are your concerns about the possibility of Trump supporters, if in fact the current president goes on to lose, being ginned up by Trump, by Fox News, not so much by the news, but by the primetime talk show hosts? What's your concern about what that might portend?
Well, it's so hard to speculate. So many people were expecting violence on the day of the election, for example, and luckily that did not happen. I think the longer the result remains uncertain, the more potential for violence there is. And Timothy is absolutely right. Historically speaking, it would be very unusual for a wealthy, consolidated democracy like the United States to fall into a full-scale civil conflict. But some of the ingredients are there for a sort of low-level conflict, or some kind of attempts at insurgency. Based on his statements today, it's clear Trump doesn't plan to concede easily, so we may expect lawsuits and other things like that. But Trump does not have the administrative resources or the security apparatus support to mount a coup if it's clear that he's lost. So hopefully once Biden crosses the threshold of the needed 270 votes, the situation will stabilize.
And Bessma, let me tweak the question a bit for you, which is to say, if something does happen in the United States, what danger does that potential instability mean for us on this side of the border?
Well, remember, we have the longest undefended border in the world. It's vital to us to have, peace, calm, and security in the United States. It's not good for us. And it's something that I'm sure our officials are watching. I mean, I would just add to the previous points. Look, the reality is the United States is really well armed. Individuals are very well armed, and they tend to be mostly pro-Republican. And that is dangerous. That is concerning. And some of these weapons are very much military grade. And so you can't ignore, low-level violence for sure. But we've already seen the kind of intimidation tactics in a number of places, from, vigilantes taking to the Biden bus in Texas to, blocking bridges. So I would be concerned, particularly if Trump loses to perhaps courts and other types of mechanisms that they increasingly see the populist nationalists as illegitimate, as part of that, liberal elite of experts. That's really, I think, the concern. So I don't want to, one doesn't want to be Chicken Little here, but at the same time, one can't help but realize that this is a country that's very well armed. It's a consolidated democracy, absolutely. But unlike most consolidated democracies, most people don't carry very, violent weapons in their homes. And that's the case of the United States.
And Janice, if you were about to brief, let's say, high-ranking government officials on how Canada ought to prepare for potential violence in the United States, what would you tell them?
So first of all, I disagree very strongly with Stephen Marsh, as you know, in his prediction of civil war. And actually, that kind of, to be blunt here, hyped conversation is just not helpful. Secondly, if I were talking to our officials, I would put the risk of more than very sporadic incidents very low down the list. Now, why would that be, Steve? First of all, we saw Trump refuse to concede and tell us what he was going to do. He was going to go the constitutional route here. He's going to the Supreme Court. Right away, that falls within the boundaries of acceptable constitutional process, not outside. Secondly, and here's a point that I think we don't make often enough, Trump believes that since he appointed 3 justices to the Supreme Court, he will get the support of that court. And that's actually helpful that he believes that, although I don't agree with him. The 3 justices that he appointed are all social conservatives, defined by their opposition to abortion and minority rights and LGBTQ rights, and not to minimize the seriousness of those kinds of views. Nevertheless, these judges are constitutionalists. And more than that, some of them are what in the United States lexicon are called originalists, where the Constitution ranks holy. I have great confidence that if it comes to any kind of conflict between this president and the fundamental values of democratic practice and democratic process, the court will not support him. And it will make him very, very difficult for the Trumpists and the Trump campaign to take to the streets when justices that were appointed by Trump and a court shaped by Trump do not support the president in these kinds of challenges. So we are a long, long, long way from violence, both in time. This process is going to drag on in an excruciating way, but more important, in practice.
But Janice, I can easily imagine, and I bet you can too, if, for example, this gets to the Supreme Court and the court goes against the current president and says there have been no violations of the law here, sorry, you lost, you got to go. It wouldn't surprise me at all to see him up at a podium in front of 5,000 people somewhere saying, and I put these people on the court and look how they've deceived me, look how they've betrayed me, and then ginning up the whole thing all over again. What do you do then?
Steve, I don't believe that's credible. Don't forget, a very short while ago, he was standing in the Rose Garden celebrating his latest appointee as an outstanding person. He's put a third of the members, a third of the judges on this court. He cannot now turn around and say these people are illegitimate and they cheated him on the election. It won't be believable.
Well, Timothy Garton-Ash, you wrote this just a few days ago. You said, quote, democracies everywhere must prepare for the contingency of a contested result. How do they do that?
So not like we did in 2000, where we were all over the place. And, for example, the German president congratulated George W. Bush and then withdrew his congratulations and then had to restore them weeks later. So I think it's really important that all the democracies in the world, countries like Canada, Britain, Germany, Australia, have a similar position, which is keep calm, watch carefully, and wait to see how that process Janice has just described is played out. And I'm actually with her that if it goes to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court rules against him, I think senior Republicans at that point will also say to him, you've got to go with it. Can I make a broader point, Steve, which is, you know, we are in the midst of a global democratic recession. This is the first year since 2000 that there are less democracies in the world than there are non-democracies. Now, it's already clear that the United States is not going to be able to lead the great renewal, worldwide renewal of democracy, because that would have needed an unambiguous landslide victory for Biden and getting the Senate, okay? So that means it's actually more up to us, more up to countries like Canada and Britain and the EU and Australia and so on, to do the domestic renewal of liberalism broadly conceived, to win back those voters who've gone to the populist nationalists, but also to lead, so to speak, the international renewal of liberal democracy, because I'm afraid from what we used to call the leader of the free world, we're not going to get that leadership in the next 4 years, even if it's President Biden.
Well, that's a fair point, Seven. Now, you know, back in the day, we always used to think that we counted on the Americans to lead, to be that shining city on a hill, and lead the world towards more democracy. That's not going to. That certainly hasn't been the case the last 4 years, and may not be for the next 4 either. To what extent do you think the rest of the democratic world can lead that effort in the absence of a strong America?
Well, let me back up historically. If we look at the spread of democracy over the past century, we see these waves of democratic transformations that happen after global disruptions. They happen after World War I, after World War II, after the Soviet collapse. After all these shocks, we see democratic waves that sweep entire regions. But in all three of those crises, the U.S. emerged as the winner, right? It showed that it could survive and triumph in a crisis. That has not been the case in this crisis, as we've already mentioned. The U.S. has not shown itself to be a model worthy of emulation. And I think that's really America's most important contribution to global democracy, not its efforts at democracy promotion, which have often been clumsy and hypocritical, but through its status as a success story, as a democracy that works for its people, as a model worthy of emulation and a side worth joining too. And a lot of that appeal, and with it the appeal of democracy, is tarnished regardless of what happens in the next few days. Now, it's not like China or Russia have come up with better answers so far, and the U.S. certainly does not have a monopoly on what democracy represents. But to the extent that fewer people are looking at the U.S. and saying, I'd like to live there, I'd like to study there, and if I can't do that, I'd like to live like that. To the extent that fewer people are saying this, then the lesser the appeal for democracy around the world, regardless of what other democratic states do.
Well, let me pick up on that. And we got about 5 minutes to go here, and I just want to pluck a few different regions out of the world and have you comment on them. Besma, I'll start with you with the Middle East. Is it reasonable for people to infer, you know, Donald Trump has signed some pretty good peace treaties, or, you know, at least they've happened on his watch, let's put it that way, between a few Arab countries and the state of Israel right now. Should we infer that if he's no longer there and Biden takes over, that process slows down?
Well, I mean, I think those deals are really arms deals, coded with this normalization deals. They really are just basically an opportunity to sell more arms to the Arab Gulf states. Now, would that be, I think, stopped under a Biden presidency? I think it's going to be more complicated for sure, and that would really depend on the makeup of both Congress and the House. And certainly, I think a lot of the Democratic members of Congress are going to be far more critical of those arms sales we've already seen. And some of that comes from what they believe as also taking away the competitive qualitative edge that Israel would get or would lose, I should say, from having those arms deals go through. And also to the real concern that some of those arms deals may in fact also embolden them to carry on with some of the foreign policy disasters like Yemen, for example. So I think there is going to be a rethinking of those for sure if a Biden presidency comes through.
Timothy, let me ask you about the country you're in right now. He's a good guy, Trump said of British Prime Minister Boris Johnson last year. He's a friend of mine. Trump has backed a couple of Johnson's key priorities, Brexit and a free trade deal with the United States. Do we think Bojo is pulling hard for a Trump victory here?
With friends like that, I'm tempted to say, look, Trump likes Brexit and doesn't like the EU. Biden dislikes Brexit and likes the EU. So you have to take Britain and Europe together. Short term, Trump would obviously be better for Brexit in the sense of getting a trade deal. But in the longer term, it's clearly in the British and European interest to have a Biden presidency. It's going to be better for them both in the longer term. Now, with Biden, we're not going to get the shining city on a hill back in the United States, but he will give us the opportunity in the EU, in Britain, and working with countries like Canada, Australia, and other democracies around the world to do more of the heavy lifting. So it's up to us now to be the shining cities on the hill, or maybe on the prairie.
Maybe on the prairie. Seva, let me ask you about a country you know all too well, Russia. What do you think they are currently making of the state of American democracy and the electoral results so far?
Well, when Trump won, you might recall, Russian officials were ecstatic. They were opening bottles of champagne in the Russian parliament. Everything was going to be so different. But the fact is, for all the nice things Trump has to say about Putin, relations have not improved. We've seen multiple rounds of sanctions. We've seen a U.S. security strategy that calls for a return to competition with Russia and China. We've seen $1.5 billion of military support for Ukraine from the U.S. So, there was a poll done of Russian citizens just a couple of weeks ago by Levada, which is a reliable Russian polling company. And the overwhelming winner with 65% was it does not matter. They just don't seem to care who will win the election. And they're probably right. Relations with Russia will probably remain bad in either scenario. With Biden, Russia has a whole other set of issues, like talk of human rights, et cetera, that Putin would prefer not to deal with. But in fact, I think relations will be bad no matter what. Now, overall, it's clearly better for U.S. foreign policy to see rejection of Trump's foreign policy, which has been very unpredictable. But we should remember also that the foreign policy consensus of Obama and Bush before him, which is what Biden represents, is not some panacea. It is not some golden age where America did everything right. And Russia's ambivalence is indicative of that so-called traditional U.S. foreign policy also does not have a great record of human rights or international law. So reasserting America's right to sit at the head of the table, which is what a return to traditional foreign policy means, is not exactly something just to celebrate.
Janice, take us to China. Do you think the Chinese leadership is really pulling hard for Biden to win?
Well, they clearly were. There's no question about it. They clearly were. And there are lots of capitals around the world today, Steve, that are not having good days. Beijing is one as they watch this. Istanbul is another. Moscow, as Seva said. There's a group, frankly, of authoritarian leaders who are in sympathy with Trump's instinct for authoritarianism. But if I can come back, and I know we just have a minute or so to Timothy's really important point about liberalism, because we haven't talked about that. We talked about democracy. We talked about a world order that is going now, and I think it's probably gone. But liberalism is separate from that. You can be a democracy, but not be a liberal democracy. And I think really what Timothy was arguing, that liberal mandate has gone from the United States and is not likely to come back. And as many Europeans cite, 4 years, you can say it was an accident and we just had to breathe deeply. 8 years, that's too long. And so there is a liberal agenda now, which is probably not a foreign policy agenda in all honesty, because we have no right to preach to the world. But it is an agenda of internal renewal of liberal democratic practices in Europe and Canada and in other like-minded states. If we don't do it, it's just not going to get done.
Sheldon, can I have a 4-shot, please, so I can say goodbye to 4 very smart people who helped us with a really solid show tonight. Janice Stein and Seva Gunitsky, both from U of T on the bottom rung. Besma Momani from CG, Timothy Garton-Ash from Oxford on the top shelf. Great to have all 4 of you on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.